Good evening and welcome back to the Mob Archaeologist. I'm Angelo here with Rick and Eric. Unfortunately, Tony, it's his birthday. He's not going to be able to make it. So we'll wish him a happy birthday. But I would like to introduce our guest here, who is Frank Fiordilino. Frank is a former affiliate of the Bonanno family, and his own family goes way back into Castellamare, spanning more than a century. And he has an expertise on this group that rivals most other individuals. If I had to choose between interviewing Joe Massino or Frank here for an extensive history on the bananas, I would prefer Frank. So, Frank, thank you for being here and welcome.
Thank you. That's actually a very flattering compliment. Thank you, Angelo.
No, of
But
course.
I don't know. I think Joe would probably know a little bit more about the Bonanno family than myself. But who knows? I mean, that's for you guys to judge, not me. And but I know whatever. Thank you though. Thank you for the compliment.
No, of course.
Yeah, we appreciate having you on.
If it's a compliment, it might be a double-edged sword. You know what I mean. Depends who looks at it that way.
Yeah, so Frank, maybe you could start out by talking about you coming to the U.S. because you were born in Sicily, but you came at a young age. What brought your family to New York, and what kind of immigrant community did you guys join?
Great question, actually. People always, it wasn't the mob that brought us to New York. It was the trying times, the economy that seemed to had gotten a little better around the 60s, starting to start to take a dive. Well, there was the earthquake in 68, if you guys are familiar with that, in Sicily. So the immigrants, although they weren't coming as an abundance as let's say back in the 50s, they started to come again in the early 70s, late 60s, and the economically, and I think my dad lost his job at the time. I'm pretty sure that's how that went down, and we had family here, and my mother had a brother in New York, and my dad had pretty sure two brothers in New York, and we decided to come as a family, and we immigrated to New York in the summer of '72 in Bushwick, Brooklyn.
And so one of your uncles was John Fiordilino, and
right. But we came to see. But yes, my uncle John. We used to come back and forth. He had lived here. His children, I'm pretty sure, were born in the United States.
Okay.
And then that would be my father's brother, younger brother actually, and then my mother's brother, Frank Navarra, who was already here. I think he had been here maybe, I'm guessing since '67 or '68. He didn't have no family here. He had just had been married around 70. He had two small children at the time, I believe, my two cousins, Bill and Anthony. And my mom, I guess he got homesick, and my mom said, "You know what? My brother's out there. He's doing pretty good. Let's go there." And that's where it began.
And what neighborhood was that?
That was in the Bushwick part of Brooklyn. There was a lot of Castellamines at the time. To give a picture of how the neighborhood used to be back then, it was primarily Sicilian at the time. The Italian Americans, you had Italian Americans, but the ones that were there usually were Sicilian. And you had store shops. You had a lot of Italian kind of stores, the meat markets, the pizza shops, the bakeries, the coffee shops, which, as we know and we'll talk about, were like little havens and get-togethers for the mob in particular. The mob we're talking about today, the Bonanno family. So we started incorporating ourselves in the neighborhood. My uncle, my brothers were young at the time. My uncle found them little jobs to help out with ends meet, and one of my younger brothers, not my younger, he's older than me, but 8 years, he was working for my uncle at the time. He owned a little construction job as doing a little paperwork, just to keep him busy. And he was going to school at the time. and I had my sister and her husband to be. He had to live. Obviously, he couldn't live with us unless they were married, but he also immigrated at the time himself.
So conservative family, then traditional Sicilian, kind of like traditional values is
Yes,
what I mean.
yeah, more morally, as far as we'll get to that.
Yeah,
Cultish, but more, yes,
gotcha.
everything had to be done the right way as far as like even you had to go through the protocols of marriage.
This is very interesting because you mentioned that your family arrived at the end of the 60s, beginning of the 70s. Yeah, that follows a similar immigration pattern for a lot of people because back in the 60s to about the mid 70s, there was a third similar but very smaller immigration from Sicilians coming to America. Detroit, Philadelphia, New York, obviously, Miami. I want to say even other places like the Midwest. And when they arrived, they already had relatives that were connected here. So your family was arriving to Bushwick, but you already had relatives that were long in the United States.
Yeah, well, not yes, we did, or families that were married into families like my aunt's family was here already. For example, my uncle John's wife, who was a Giordano, they've been here for a while. Her brother was Tony Giordano, so they were there. They were really Americanized. Actually, his mother was born here, my Aunt Maria, and she even went back even further. We had family that was here, a lot of family that would immigrate back and forth, you know, um, and to bring back the 70s and that era right there, like the early 70s to the mid 70s, that was the last exodus of Sicilians into the United States. I mean, I went to a school that had the bilingual program. You're familiar with that, the Italian ones, and a lot of the kids in my class were either first generation or born on the other side as well. But as I got older, that trend died down. The economy got better in Italy and then in Sicily, rather in Sicily, and which we have to differentiate because the Italians were doing a lot better. When I mean Italians, the mainland Italians before we were in Sicily. So, but by the time the Sicilians got it together economically, that's when the immigration flow to the United States slowed down.
And so you saw yourself as distinct from the mainland Italians. You didn't come over and feel immediately part of the Italian Americans. You kind of saw yourself as a Sicilian. Is that right?
Well, yes, because I mean the only connection to Italian people of Italy was through TV, Italian TV. Other than that, it wasn't around me. Sicilians were around me, and of course, a smaller percentage of Southern Italians, either Calabrians or Neapolitans or Barese. They were there, but not as many as Sicilians.
Frank, I appreciate everything you're sharing so far, and you have a unique experience in your background in Castellamare. So I'm wondering if you have any unique insight into the history and politics and the Cosa Nostra in Castellamare that maybe the average person doesn't know that you could share with us.
Okay, so if we had anybody to structure the way that the mentality, the Castellamese mentality, in regards to government and people and within ourselves, or the way we were conducted ourselves among each other in those in especially in the 20th century and the early parts to the mid 20th century, would have to be one of the pioneers of our town that learned to get along with everybody. And he was definitely, if you had a problem, you had to go to him, and he was a fair person, and we kind of adopted his way of conducting ourselves in Cosa Nostra. We didn't think it was criminal. We just thought it was fair. It was just, and that would probably be out of the Baventry family, the Vito Baventry, and then and his cousins as well. The Baventry family very conducive or influential rather to the way the Castellamines Cosa Nostra grew at it at. And as we know, Joe Bonanno was a Baventry, his mother was. And the other side of that was we had another clan, the Buccellatos, which were the other side of that group, which were more like, if you will, redneck and mountainous, where the Bonaventries knew how to use the pen, diplomacy, to get far. And you see that in Joe Bonanno a lot, but that didn't come out of him. That was there before Joe Bonanno was Joe Bonanno. That evolved with the Baventry family.
So you mentioned the mountain because Castellamare, I've never been there, but there's the town down by the water, and then it goes up into the hills behind that. So the Buccellatos were from the mountain or the hill, is that right?
They were the mountain people, and their little groups were mountain. They were into livestock, thieving, all that kind of stuff you see in the South in the United States back in the day. They were probably more redneck actually. And then you had the people from the town and the people from the water. You had the fishermen groups. We have the ex Mattarella, who was his son was president not too long ago. But Bernardo Mattarella, who was like the governor of Sicily, was also from our town, and he was more of affiliated with the Baventry clan and the more aristocratic kind of approach, And then you had the other Buccellatos who were the more of, the cowboy way.
Yeah, there was a Pentito, a guy who flipped in Sicily, who said Mattarella was a made member of Castellamare. And Joe Bonanno talked about getting the red carpet laid out for him when he visited by Bernardo Mattarella. So that's interesting.
He was one of the most. If there was anybody at the 1950s that had that kind of influence, especially after 43, after the Americans came in and liberated us, and the next people we were actually going against and fighting against were the with communism, and I'm talking about the United States. They joined hands with the Cosa Nostra, and Mattarella had a lot to do with that. He was working hand in hand with the CIA and the mob.
It's interesting. How about other families? The Galantes, Magadinos. Do you hear about them?
The Galante family, as far as the Galantes, another clan that are from the mountains themselves. We know about Carmine Galante. They all come from Galante. They come from that other area. Yes, they were a mob, part of the mob clan too, but they were part of the Buccellatos as well. I mean, they all coexisted together, but there was at one time they did not get along, and that was back. I think Joe Bonanno talks about that himself. He actually tries to bring out that he was the olive branch, and I brought this out already, between the Buccellato clan and the Baventry clan. But at the end of the day, it really wasn't that way, because they were still going at it even after he was born. It was more like Mattarella that brought the peace between both parties.
Interesting. And was there corruption in the local government in Castellamare? Was their mafia, was it mobbed up, like we see in Chicago or someplace over
as
here?
As far as like extortion, they kind of got along with each other. It was since it was a beach resort town, a lot of tourists or foreigners or people from other towns used to come and try to establish businesses and everything. They got the ones who were approached about money, and it usually got done diplomatically in my town. But it wasn't usually paisan to paisan. And when I use the word paisan, people from the same town.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so that's how that usually went down. And I mean, I when I was there in '90, I actually witnessed a place go up in smoke because they were in pain. Not when I seen it go up, I didn't see the actual action. And
Right.
It did exist even back then.
So everybody knew each other there. Is that right? I mean, not every single person, but in
It was a
general.
fraternity. If you didn't know the person, you knew the family. You know, the families one knew the other. It was at one time I think like 11,000 people. Now I think it's up to 14,000 in the summertime. There's more because of tourism. But before that, before that, 11,000 people, and they knew each other. If you didn't know, like I said, if you didn't know the person, you knew the person's brother, vice versa.
And that was transplanted to Bushwick. You know, we know the Bonannos and Castellammare were in Williamsburg, then Bushwick. So when you guys settled in Bushwick, it was kind of the same. Where you
Right, my
knew
dad
of
used to go around, and then somebody seen him and said, "Hey, what the hell you doing here?" Okay. Oh, you went to school with my brother. All right, we're over here. Okay, you're so and so's brother. Very very small minority of people from my town tried to like distance themselves from, and if they did, they really didn't say anything. They just did it. You know, you had to be careful about talking about people of organized crime, even in Bushwick. Um, we had our undercover commies in our towns. They were always talked about, but they tended not to stay in their lane, if you will. And even years later, I remember in my 20s. Oh, his father was a commie. This guy was like, and all that crap. They used to have the marches and they used to do their thing, but they stayed in their lane for the most part in my town.
So when you come to the U.S., your uncle John, he had become a captain when Gaspar de Gregorio took over from.
Gloria,
Yeah. So and then I don't know if he was still a captain when you guys arrived, but I mean, he was already kind of an esteemed guy.
you could tell there was some kind of friction when we were here. He would come back and forth. He wasn't here. There's something as a kid, it felt like he would come back. It wasn't like he was in trouble or anything, but it was like he wasn't as active around 75. When I remember coming in 72, I didn't see my Uncle John or meet my Uncle John till about 76 or 75. And he had family here where his wife did. Her brother was Santo Giordano. So there was a kind of new, it felt like where my uncle would have always respected and talked about ending the life, looked like that his kind of his group friends and regime were kind of like not, I hate using that fucking word, regime. But his kind of clique and all was not longer as active. He had a brother-in-law, he had a buddy, another compadre who was killed in 72, Vito Licata, who was related to the two Licatas who ended up dying in the 80s. But it looked like there was another rise in that time, and it was I guess if what you guys, the Sicilians who had come, the younger ones in '68, that people regard as Carmine Galante's people, and I hate the word, but Zips, yeah.
Yeah, a lot of the focus is on guys like Cesar Bonventuri and Baldo Amato, important guys for sure, younger guys. But some of that foundation of this second wave of immigration or third wave, whatever it was, were guys like your uncle, guys like Joe Buccellato. So those guys kind of laid the foundation for the Sicilians becoming big again. Is that your take?
It was a change of times, I think that push was initiated by the release of Carmine Galante coming out of prison in '74, and where it looked like that the Bonanno family was losing a lot of momentum during the Castellammare avalanche. That used to be obvious at one time. He kind of rewired the whole system again and said we're going back to 101, and that's what he was trying to do.
We always hear about Castellamare, or most books and sources go into that. What I'm curious is what connections in the life is Castellamare connected to primarily? I mean, there would be Alcamo, I'm assuming, but what other cities? What about Santa Ninfa and other places?
Well, as far as the Castellamare, it was always Alcamo. Alcamo was there as far as the resurfacing of the mob at 43. In 1943, when it resurfaced, we had and I'll tell you why, because you had Galante Badalamenti was from Shitas, and he was married to a woman from my town, the Vitali sisters, and so was Filippo Remi from Alcamo. They were married to two sisters from Alcamo, and the Remi family was very popular. And if you know Alcamo, it's a bigger city than a bigger town rather than Castellammare, the Gulf. It's about 70,000. So they kind of figured they were together, but they kind of answered to the Remy family. And the Bucciolato was one of the Bucciolatos was married to Remy as well, the one who got killed in 82.
Is that Nino Bucciolato?
Yes. That who also was Tony Giordano's uncle.
Okay. And then there's kind of a rivalry between Castellammare and Alcamo, at least within the Mafia too. I mean, that came out a few years ago. They were investigating, and it came out that he has some issues with Alcamo, and there's some internal politics there.
I wouldn't know about like the latest stuff going out of there. But I just could talk about the guys that were there at the time. You're talking about the 90s mob. I wouldn't know nothing. Right. As far as Italy goes, you want to talk about the United States, that's fine. No, I'd rather leave them guys out.
Sounds good.
Well, let me ask you, there's probably a lot of questions about, the Bonanno family.
But I knew who he was talking about.
Okay. Yeah, the Bonanno family was known to be big into drugs and everything, especially Carmine Galante. And is there any, thing that maybe some additional information that you could, provide us about your knowledge about the Bonanno family's involvement in the drug trade?
Not much. I mean, my family wasn't involved in it direct, but I knew people that were, and there was always stories, of Castellammare people that were, especially during the Pizza Connection days, even more. But Carmine Galante was as well. But as far as the Castellammare, the brethren, if you will, they were all getting together. They were more into the Pizza Connection, where Carmine goes back to the 50s, 60s. And even some may say he might have had involved in the one before that, the French Connection. But as far as like the Castellammare and the drug trade, that was all the Pizza Connection days through the resurfacing. They came out like, a lot of younger generations. You had Ferrara, he did 30 years, another paisan of mine. I'm thinking about the little guys. I'm not Cesar Boventre or even Marlo, but the smaller guys that were the tentacles of that case. There were a lot of Castellammare involved, but that's when it became a lot of Vario, low Vario. There was a lot of them.
Yeah, I think Luigi Roncesvalli, he there was a recent book about him, and
right, talking about Mimo Tartamello, whose family. I know exactly what you're talking about. He lived upstairs from me for about 3 years, but we go back forever. Mimo did, and he talks about him. I just feel that guy was a little bit of a fib. The Luigi Ronzavelli from Catania guy. I felt that he really didn't bring a lot to the table as far as that goes.
Yes, interesting character.
Yeah.
I think he mentioned Pietro Alfano. Maybe
Pietro Alfano was see if you run the names, it comes to me right away. He was from Shinas. He was Badalamenti's nephew. Yeah, but you're talking about that whole case in general?
Well, the involvement with the Bonannos, the Bonanno family and their associates.
Right. You had Badalamenti on the case. He was the head guy in the case. You had Cesar Alfano. You had Baldo.
Sal
Catalano, of course, who's also my cousin's uncle. He's related to the niece.
So here's a question for you. You came over as a young kid, as a baby, right? And then when do you start becoming aware of Cosa Nostra? The relatives are involved with this, what it is. Like, what are your formative experiences with just kind of realizing this is a thing, and how did you interpret it?
Well, growing up, like even as very small as a kid, I had a death in my family in 1977. And I remember the cops coming and to the house. You could see already, get him inside, talking about me. I'm like 7. Watch what he's, don't say nothing. Go to the store. So we knew we were hiding. We were hiding something, and I knew the cops were the bad guys at a very young age. And it wouldn't be there, even with the old people, because you got to remember, English was the second language on my block on Himrod and Knickerbocker. Okay, the people at the stores talked to me in Sicilian. Everybody talked to me in Sicilian. You know, unfortunately, you'd figure you try to incorporate this new language or this new place, but to a young kid, but we were stuck in our own ways. Not their fault at all, my family. And that used to happen a lot. The old people like, go grab that right away. If there was something that fell off a truck, it was like, I didn't think it was wrong. I think we were just doing it, and instead of like put that back, if I went to the store with my friend and his dad or something, and we grabbed a couple of things, and then he's driving us out, back home, and we got something. Where'd you get that? Oh, that's not nice. But then they'll laugh. You know what I mean? So it made it right. So that's how I knew I was part of something that was not very antisocial. Absolutely. I wasn't allowed to, people, you would go to the pharmacy and there would be like those little toys when you bought the fake badge with the gun, stuff like we weren't allowed to buy that.
Yeah. Did you start to become aware of the organization after that? Like you started to realize those things? Did you start to realize there was a formal entity too?
Very young, very young. I talk about funerals because those are where I'm aware there's consequences. And that normally people die naturally or whatever, accidental, but not getting shot or killed. So and then you hear as you get older, you hear what happened. And kids are very like they're spongy; they absorb and start absorbing stuff. Like I wonder what happened. You hear the women talk, whatever, and you kind of see that's a consequence. It's never about why he died. It's about if he got killed, it was always he did something wrong. So that was a consequence that came with being part of my culture. Not, I don't want to offend because people who are Sicilian be like, not all of us were like that, and that's true. But very true. But it's part of my growing up. Rather, I'll put it at.
And so right around that time, you were saying your Uncle John's becoming less active, but then you mentioned his brother-in-law, Tony Giordano, Santo Giordano, and he becomes very important right around that time, right around the time
Right.
Galante seizes power. What was your, because you grew up around him, what was your take on his trajectory?
On Santo, very intelligent, very, very. I wouldn't if you'd ask me who were your like who do you feel are people that are part of that life at, let's say, at 10 and 11, but by 10 I got it. I knew I didn't know what was going on, but I knew there was a pyramid, you know what I mean, of who's on top, who's always getting respect when they walk in a room. I got that. Who sits at the head of a table. And he was very educated, very into he was a car. He started as a mechanic. He built his own planes. He had presidential quality. Could have went to school and became huge. But he was very liked among his friends because he brought those qualities, and very loved at that too. And he got under the he got herded up by Galante like some of his buddies, and the rest was history.
Yeah, I mean, they linked him to the Galante hit. I think they found his print or something to that effect.
Right.
And then most people know him though because he hosted the three captains meeting where those guys got taken out. So he's part of these two major events in the family during that time. He doesn't get a lot of attention, but it's great to get what was his personality like you just said. I find that very interesting.
Very approachable, very nice. Came off as I won't use a lawyer because lawyers are mostly shysters. Came off as a professor type, if you will. He had those qualities. very educated, very educated. Unfortunate, sad, looking back, that he could have went a very far, long way in his life.
Yeah, 'cause he took a bullet in the three captains thing and then died in a plane crash. Is that right?
Yes, he died. He died in a plane crash in '84, his own plane, and that was it. And he came from a extremely long line of mob family on his dad's side as well.
And you said his uncle was Nino Buccellato, who was the boss of Castellamare, who got killed, right?
Right, who he basically he was related by marriage. Who he flew in his own plane, that one that fell. He went to pick him up in Canada to bring him back to New York and his wife when they came to visit. And that was a year later he was killed in that Sicilian War back in Italy.
Yeah, so the Sicilian War impacted Castellamare too. We think of it as Palermo, but obviously it had impacts all around the island.
Right. They wanted to get rid of the old guard and put their own people in. The Corleones did, and that's where that came about.
Huh.
Yeah.
So arriving in New York, you're still a pretty young guy. You have.
I'm 2 years old.
You're as old as you feel. You look pretty young. You've arrived and you're of the younger generation, and you have an idea of the tradition of this being part of something that extends back. And you also have the family bloodlines and the links that extend all the way back to Castellamare. My question is, how many people that were affiliated, made, not made, that share that same connection? Are there still a lot of people that have those bloodlines, or are they, one-offs who end up joining, based
Very
on
few. Very few. It doesn't work. That started like after the Galante hit, and then after the I would say the Caesar Ventry murder in '84. The Bonanno family was taking a different route. If you were Castellamare, you had to be one that was had to be open to the new Bonanno family, which was very Italian American. Their upper echelons was all Neapolitan born, not born, American born, usually Neapolitan descent. You had a couple of guys still, but the more and more time that passed, the less and less there was Castellamares there in the family. Even up to today, there's very few. And the ones that are, they're not as not active at all. Well, they're not active, but not. I'm sorry. What I meant is they're not affluent or up there. They tried that with the Iron Man kid over there with Ventagna, but that didn't work.
So that faction, or we'll call it a faction now, that still exists within within the Banana Network, but there's other factions
Today?
now. Yeah.
No.
No?
No,
Okay.
no, they just happen to be Castellamares that happen to be in the family that happen to have traditions back. Like I'll give you an example. Vinny Asaro, he's Castellamares himself, but he's more looked at as an Italian American as he is a Castellamares. His granddad was a Castellamares, and a made guy as well. He is Castellamares, but is that a faction? It's not a faction. No. I think Joe Messina, I know Joe Messina tried to eliminate that as much as possible. If he had the Castellamares that were still around, he separated them. He never elevated Baldo for that reason. He kept them where he wanted to keep them, I guess, out of retaliation, fear, being Joe Messina. Now a lot of stuff is coming out about him that he was always wary about anything or anybody who had a little bit of respect. He always kind of took the Canadian faction with a grain of salt, and especially after they killed Giorgio. So it was after Joe Messina comes into the picture, after all that, that's in the early '90s. But he pretty much ran the family, even when Rosselli was around, and he was still in jail through his brother-in-law. It was an Italian American family at that point.
One thing that's interesting about Galante is Galante is Castellamare. He's considered old school.
I'm sorry, I don't mean to interrupt it. I just
go ahead.
It was a long day. the Castellamines families or the factions of the Castellamines Bonanno family died the day Galante got killed. And if you want to put, allegedly there was 3 or 4 Castellamines involved in that hit. And now that you thought that was the day, so they killed their own destiny, I guess.
It's ironic too because
their own heritage, their own tradition was killed that day.
Yeah, Galante, despite being cast in a race, he's responsible for bringing in a lot of this mainland element back in the 60s, like his crew back then. And Griffin's going to go into this.
Yeah. Well, that's what's always been. He didn't bring them; they were here already, and either their uncles were here or they came here to work. But they knew they feel them out. It's like the old heads looking for the younger ones that are able. They look for that. And like Caesar, for example, Baldo, they didn't come here and say, "Hey, we're coming to join the mob." That's just a myth. They were here looking for the American dream. Obviously, they found in other places, and but nobody was being recruited. That's foolish.
That was a poor choice of words on my part. I mean, I was referring to
no, not you. You read it. It's not you. You read it a lot of places. You hear about that. It's a meeting process. You meet the person, you see what he can do, and then that's how it goes.
You'll read that Bonventuri and Amato were made in Sicily and like brought over as adults. They were here as teenagers, right?
Well, do the math. So I think they came in 68, 7. What is he, like 70 now? No, they were groomed here for sure.
Makes sense.
So was Tony Giordano. I mean, yes, he had the predicate, he had the family. Let's walk him through. But if he would have said, "Hey, look, I don't want to do this. I want to do something else," they were like, "Oh, they're making their bones in Sicily." It don't work.
I wanted to follow up on an earlier question that Eric asked about when he first learned about the Cosa Nostra. And, just kind of a short question. What kind of words, what kind of language did they use? Because, they probably didn't say, they probably didn't use the words Mafia, Cosa Nostra. They probably said,
Good question. That's a
our
good
thing.
question. So growing up in Bushwick, there was two families. There wasn't 5. One was the Gambino family, which was at that time very minority, of Cosa Nostra, and then there was obviously the Bonanno family. The Sicilians referred to the Bonannos as the Castellamines family. So it was like Castellamines, which means the people from that town, and the Gambinos were known as the Palermitan because that's where they're from.
Mm.
And that's how you but they didn't call themselves the Bonanno Gambino family or whatever, For a while, there was some Castellamines. I remember when Joe Messino came about, the old timers that didn't know, that thought Joe Messino was actually Joe Messina from Castellamare. So they probably thought it was a relative of somebody named Messina back in like Godfather, for example. He didn't know Joe. He left in 79. So he went to California. He goes, "This is Messina." I go, "No, he's American." And, so a lot of people didn't know.
How did those guys feel about that? How did some of your relatives, the older guys around you, how did they feel about having Neapolitan Americans as bosses and that kind of thing?
They got along. I mean, they got along, but at the same time, you had the rogues, ones who said something. I heard the late. He's not here no more. Mimo D'Artamella. I remember him coming back. He went to Italy and came back. We were like family, and saying stuff like they killed that good guy or that good guy. We would have showed them. They caught him. They caught him in Tradimento. That means like they caught him by surprise, or this thing would have been a whole lot different. And I knew a guy that was with him at the time went like this, like, "Shh, stop," and that maybe had to do because I was in the car and my uncle was went with the flow, even though he was Castellamines. I'm talking about Frank Navarro. He was a Messina loyalist, it was like, okay, this is where it's at now. This is where we're at. Yes, I'm Castellanese, but this is where I'm at. So when Mimo started saying that I would have never said anything anyway. And he was referring to Caesar Baventri being killed.
And so Baldo kind of fell in line then. Did he get along with the Messina administration and everything that you know of?
This is according to paperwork on Sal Vitale, and I don't know how true it is. So, but this is his testimony. I believe he has nothing to lie about. That day, if Baldo was to show up as well, he was supposed to be killed. And then when they called him in, he came in. He fell in line. He did his 5 years in the Pizza Connection case, and it was like they were watching him, I guess, and they put him with other bosses, with another captain, and they kept him there until he got arrested again. So that was it. That basically, if you want to talk about the last days of the Castellamines mob tradition or the higher ups and everything like that, you'd have to go to probably the murder of Carmine Galante and the other two that were involved too. There was two guys there. They were there. They were also Castellamines gangsters, but not higher ups. They were just friends, I guess. There was Leonardo Coppola and Joe Turano that.
What's the reputation of, during your time, what was the reputation of guys like Carmine Galante and Joe Bonanno and Bill Bonanno? What did people think about them?
They were always referred to uncles, even though they weren't your uncles. To this and to that. Salud, that means go say hello and everything, and that's what we did. But back to the immigration 72, things are coming back. Not Leonardo Coppola. My brother who passed away was very close with his brother, and we were close with their families too. We immigrated to the United States around the same time, and my dad and Leonardo Coppola, who got killed that day, they worked in the mountainside themselves. They were very close. I remember we call him Tornado, Leonardo short. They used to have a pizza shop in Broadway in Marcy Avenue. It was called Leo and Sons. I think it's still there. And we used to go there as a kid. He was same thing, say hi to Leonardo and everything. Even though he was my uncle, we know. And you see that you kind of feed off that kind of respect.
Yeah, I know that Coppola, he was working some of the time at a pizzeria in Philadelphia area, and there was a long history. There was a very small, but
there's a lot of Coppolas now. So, you're talking about Leonardo Coppola?
Yeah, he was apparently the FBI said he was splitting time, like working some of the time at a pizzeria in Philadelphia and coming back to New York.
It could be. I mean, we start going to his place in '78. And I'll tell you why, because there was a movie theater across the street on the Broadway. I think it was called the Broadway. And I remember that's where I seen Grease. I wanted to go see Grease or one of those movies. And he paid for it. And goes, yeah, go over there. There was a girl that was working at the bakery. The girl, like 15. And that was like his like family to him. He goes, bring him over there and watch the movie. And that was 78. By 79, he was dead. So, but that place, I think, is still there. And we were like family, very close, even after he died.
Yeah, Marcy Avenue that you mentioned, that's got a long history. That's where Colaschiro lived back in the 1910s and 20s. Is that
right?
Yeah, so
maybe before my time.
Yeah, it's got a long history though. So during your time, what was that area like? Marcy Avenue,
bad.
Williamsburg.
It was bad. You got to remember, it was after the blackouts. I hate to use the term. I used it a lot. White lightning occurred. They were burning stuff, and the insurance after the blackout was bad. And so there was a couple of pizzerias. It was pretty lucrative if you wanted to open up a hole in the wall, and the place was busy all the time. And it was primarily African American at the time, the neighborhood. Well, I'm talking about that period of time. And I think that's regarded Williamsburg, believe it or not, and it's on the cusp of Bedford Stuyvesant.
I know there's a large community from Bari. Bari does a
no. There was nobody out there. You know what that was back then?
Historically,
yeah. some might argue there was a lot of Sicilians. That I'm just being funny. But it was either a Hasidic Jewish, or black. That was it.
Were there any interactions between those the black or Hasidic Jewish communities and the Italians?
No, not at all. They're very segregated, and even though they live in the same block away, there was always been incidents, but they kind of like agree to disagree, but stuff would pop off now and then.
You mentioned some of the Gambino guys were in the same neighborhoods. Were those the Sicilian faction of the Gambinos?
Yes, absolutely, the Sicilian faction.
What
But
was
you got to
the
remember at the time, the Sicilian faction was the majority one time in the Gambino family as well. You got to remember that the sign of the times come in the 80s. Be it the Gambino family or the mid 80s or the Bonanno family.
Well, and then what was the relationship like? People look at these different families as if they're rival gangs or something, but were the Gambino Sicilians close with the Bonanno Sicilians and that kind of thing?
It went to person. It depended. It depended. But for the most part, there was you had more of the upper echelon Bonanno guys in Bushwick than you had the upper echelon. Let's say it's not the same in Bensonhurst where you had the top guys of the Gambino family there. In Bushwick, it was the other way around. The Bonanno guys were the top. So you had like Pat DiConti, for example, who was their go-to, to Bensonhurst. And at the time, he was the captain. And then you had a whole bunch of guys, Bonanno guys that were captains, bosses, underbosses, in Bushwick. So they kind of had to get along. You know what I mean?
And then Middle Village comes up. I mean, you spent a lot of your time in Middle Village. Did a lot of guys live in that area of Queens, or?
Middle Village is like Howard Beach. People from other places live there. They're not places. Guys. You had 4 bosses living in Howard Beach at one time. Okay, and all of them came from different places. That's where they lived. That's where they wanted to raise their children. It wasn't mobbed up neighborhoods. And Middle Village was just.
See, there's some history going on about Bonannos being involved in Wall Street. Different schemes. Anything you heard about that?
Well, what year?
I think it was during the 80s and maybe 90s.
Well, as far 90s, as far as anybody in Wall Street, there was Frank Copa, which I didn't know much about. I'm just naming people that I knew were in Wall Street that were Bonanno guys. As far as Costello and these guys, right now, I can't remember many or any. There was Frank Copa, Canarella. They had some hand in stocks and whatever. I wouldn't know much about.
Just real quick, getting back to your story, we talked about, you kind of starting to figure out what's what. But at what point do you actually become involved yourself? Was there a point where you were put on record, or how did that process go?
I kind of was on record with my uncle early, my Uncle Cheech. I guess that started when I started working in illegal gambling halls, watching the door, whatnot, doing, he had given me the opportunity to put a couple of dollars at one time. I wasn't good at it. I just didn't want to wait I want the money fast, not a little bit at a time. That's, money management was never my thing. I get in trouble. I think I was just a little bit too hot to handle for them around 90s. I was a chicken who couldn't lay eggs, and they don't like that in the mob. So after that, we kind of like, I'm not gonna say we had a disagreement, because there was no disagreeing with him. It was always one way. He was a main guy. He was my uncle, and he was very intimidating. And I just strayed away, and I was then on record with Vito Grimaldi for a while. And Vito Grimaldi was kind of like my mentor in the mob, real old fashioned, very, very. You want to talk about somebody who was Castello Medici, even though he was not. He was from Santa Ninfa. very, very customary, very, very old fashioned way of thinking. Um, Definitely Cosa Nostra 101. And I learned a lot from him. I know people say, well, you didn't learn how to keep your mouth shut, but yeah, he was definitely, these guys would have loved to listen to this guy. He was ahead of his time.
You know, you
Not ahead
mentioned,
of his time, but he was no, actually he was throwback to the old school.
you mentioned his
Respect had
hometown.
a lot to do with it. Huh?
Were you so these guys like Vito Grimaldi, I think, was born in the U.S. Did he talk about hometowns,
He
Sicilian
was.
hometowns?
Oh yeah. He was all about it. He was all about it. I mean, sometimes he would, in jest, he would say, "I'd love to go back to my hometown and just live there for the rest of my life." He's been there. His family was from there. I think his mom was actually born in the United States as well. His dad wasn't. Um, at one time, I was really close to his son. Good man. God rest his soul. Good person. Good person. After him, my uncle dies. My uncle Cheech dies, and his son, who was made at the time, he got made at 25 years old. I started going back and going with my family, So I started palling around with him, and then I got arrested.
And so how much did these
Been
guys?
around him on record.
Okay. And so you mentioned your uncle. You know, how much did your uncle actually tell you about what was going on within the organization? Did people might think because you're related, you might know everything. Was he
None of
open?
these guys told you about what was going on in the organization. They told you what not to do to piss people in the organization.
Yeah.
Or tell you go do something and do it this way. The old guys didn't talk about the organization. They told you to say hi to somebody when somebody was there. They told you how to do something, and that went for Vito too. It wasn't like I went to talk to my guy and this is the guy we gotta. It's like this guy, go say hi to him, and whatever. Or this is the way. Or why would you think like if I had gotten in a situation, he'd try to dissect it and tell you, well, why do you think that's a smart move? And why do you think if you're not making nothing, why do you think this? And he would do that. And he would talk to a lot of stuff, lot of great adages. I mean, they're still in my head today, and they go in life, in regular life. They have been. My favorite was do good and you forget, you do bad and you remember, and that was one of my favorites. I got with teary eyed thinking about it. That's who he was. He was Cosa Nostra. Don't get me wrong. You fucked up, you paid. He wasn't like but he wasn't quick to the gun either.
Hmm.
So he was
You know.
mentoring into the
Oh
life.
yeah. Well, yeah, in more ways than one. He really did. I think I disappointed him in a lot of ways. Um, I worked legitimately in his uh, bakery shop. He gave me a job as a manager. I drove him around at times. Then my mind. I was a young guy. Was looking at more the John Gottiisms of the world, and forgetting where I was from, and thinking people maybe took a lot more stock in me that they should have at the time, because I was I was a young guy. I was a young man. Yeah, believe me, he'd get pissed off with me at times too. A little
So,
wild.
so you just mentioned John Gotti. Um,
Sure.
in your experience and the people you knew, the people you hung around with, um, who are the people that were looked up to?
All right. Unfortunately for me, it was him, but at the same time, I was taken back. So look, you see where my pedigree and where I come from, and the people I'm family and all that. So in John Gotti breaks out in 1985, and I'm going to Christ the King High School, where a lot of these kids from his neighborhood are Italian American. They probably not even know what was going on, the stuff in the papers, and the mannerisms and what just broke out at the time. I was kind of like I was kind of now googly eyed. You know what I mean? And that's where it was, not knowing that he couldn't even hold a candle to most of these old timers that I knew. Or I mean, in back home and here, I was just too taken back by the aura. If I listened to some of these guys back then, when I went to jail, I probably wouldn't went to jail, but probably not stupidly.
So you were kind of a cowboy and when you were on the street.
I was wild, yeah. I was wild. I kind of like felt that I was gonna end up in two places. I kind of knew it, and That was where I was at.
Yeah.
You know, when John Gotti puts his fucking middle finger on everybody and everything, you kind of think that, well, that's cool. Well, that's what I want to do, you know?
Uh-huh.
So he was like a rebel, and that's what people admired
Yeah,
about him.
yeah, yeah. I mean, it was
He
cool as
basically you get the finger to law enforcement.
yeah, it was cool as hell, you know? I mean, who didn't like John? You know, everybody's like, he ruined this, he did that. Let me tell you, everybody was kissing his ass back in the day.
Well, it seems kind of like the traditional stuff is less fun. Is that?
Yeah, yeah, exactly. I mean, we're talking about like James's uncle, Joe Bucciolato, you know, who used to come to the coffee shop. I was a kid, you know, and he used to come to our coffee shop and get coffee, and he'd have like his little hat on and little jacket, looked like this old frail old man, and I was always told, you go over there and say hi, you don't pay for shit. You hear me? I'm like, yeah, I got you. And then you see John Gotti, you know, and this guy been doing it for him and his family for 100 years. So he must be doing something right, you know.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, but you know, you're a kid, and that's what happened to Florencio.
Yeah.
So it's kind of like Tony Montana, that Al Pacino playing Tony
No, I was no Tony
Montana.
Montana. It was more like, you know, yeah, a lot of influences came out of Hollywood. I've talked about this already. You know, if somebody pissed us off, me and my little buddies, 12, 13 years old, we used to go break the storefront windows because we got thrown out of the arcade that day, you know, stupid shit like that. And violent actions cause positive reactions in that world. You understand? And we absorbed that. We understood that.
And with that in
You know?
mind, how much of this is something that, people on the outside don't have a clear idea of. Were you getting orders, when you became an associate, were you getting orders, or were you more doing things and then they could represent you if needed?
Little of both. Little of both. By us acting out, we were advertising our services to people who were willing to take us in and say, hey, look, this guy talked bad to my wife the other day. He ain't gonna tell us that because it looks like, well, what do you think? You know, he said something, but it wasn't that bad. You know, it could have been something. He probably charged a little bit more for a freaking for some meat at the butcher shop. It wasn't nothing direct. Go by his house and flatten his tire, you know, and stuff like that. And we were like, okay, let's go. It started at a small level. Or this guy just he said something to my daughter. I want you to beat him up, but don't beat him up too bad. And we go over there and we'd fuck him up, you know. Sometimes we did what there was times where we did things on our own, and the guys were like, hey, I didn't tell you to do that.
Yep.
You know, kind of like in that scenario, it rings a bell because I knew people like that. I probably could have been like that too at one time. Where in The Sopranos, you get that Richie Aprile has those two wannabe kids around, and they take it on themselves to shoot at the kid Christopher because he put that in their head. You know, that he didn't like Christopher, so they figured it was okay. You know, you had scenarios like that in my neighborhood.
Well, that leads to my next question. Since this is your story, what are your favorite mob movies and mob TV shows?
Wow. I'm back to like 60s kind of mob stuff. There was a show, and then it got like anything else. Crime Stories. Remember that one? I like that. It was like about the Chicago mob in Las Vegas. I like that as a TV show, but as a movie, I'm a Goodfellas guy, opposed to The Godfather.
Did you ever see Joe Bonanno's movie, A Godfather Story?
Yeah, it's pretty Joe Bonanno-ish. Yeah, that's him. You know, he tries to cover up. He makes this thing a Camelot experience, and you know, I know what he's getting to. It's so customized. He's very diplomatic when they talk, but at the same time, there's a little bends. You know what I mean? Other than seeing my hometown on TV, that was about it.
The interesting thing about all the Bonanno works, be it the books or the movies, is they are all laced with elements of truth, element of lies. Bonanno, he's a beautiful liar. He knows how to just avoid or skirt or get around certain things when he's telling a story. But even that movie, there's things that he mentioned that are nowhere else, and they actually happen. There's actually elements of truth in that movie, and Rick can bring up some of the examples of that. It's a very interesting film, despite its production value.
I know. What are the examples? I find the one untruth I found was that he brings it. He always claims that he was the reason that he brought the two clans together in the town to make peace. His birth, like he was some kind of like divine intervention, and that is not true.
Yeah, that's not true.
The Bonannos were not the family that were the mob family in Castellamare del Golfo. His mother's side was the Baventry, and they were feuding with the Buccellatos. But that feud went all the way to Williamsburg in the 20s, and even Italy. Well, of course, there was a little pause after Mussolini came about in 24 to about 43, but that even started getting back again after the mob was allowed to run free in my town, and Mattarella put kind of a halt to that as well. But he was not the reason why those clans came together, not at all.
So the people you were around, your relatives, or just the people you knew, did they talk about names like Bonanno or even Maranzano? Were those names that ever came up?
Well, they did, but they did always not in a criminal aspect. Like, for example, Maranzano's brother worked with my grandfather, my mother's father, in the mountain, not in the mountain, but they used to farm by the water because my mother's side comes from the water, and at the time before there was beach houses, there used to be farmland there in Castellamare del Golfo, and they worked together, and he worked together with Maranzano's brother, and they would say that Maranzano would talk about he had a brother that was doing really, really well in New York. That kind of stuff. Yeah.
Yeah, that's interesting. That's something we haven't heard anywhere else.
Well, yeah, you'd get stuck. Yeah, it's not like my brother's killing people at New York City. He's making money.
Yeah.
He has, I mean, she has good friends. I mean, you're born. It means, you have good friends out there. But you know what that is. Nobody talks
Right.
direct, especially
Yeah.
those times. Yeah.
And our take on this stuff, I mean, I come from as far away from this stuff as you can get. Is like you read about names like Salvatore Maranzano, but I love hearing that stuff about his brother worked with a relative of yours. Like, I mean, there's a human, personal element to all this too. It's not just
Right.
mafia. It's not just this or that.
Yeah, and you got to remember something. My town, they did not trust authority, and then we were under fascist rule for about 19 years, and that even deepened the hatred. It was like a badge of honor to hide a fugitive from the law in somebody's house. They're like, your father hid me out for 4 years. You'd hear a lot of that stuff. Or my uncle, when he got in trouble, he did 5 years. He was involved in a gas station robbery. It was a young person thing. My uncle Cheech, and we had a relative that hit him out for a year and a half, and that was like great. That was the bonding between our families. That's something within the Castellamares that's thick. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
And that kind of stuff.
Angelo had mentioned the Joe Bonanno movie about
Right.
something that we didn't know before that was true. And he mentions a guy named Salvatore Maranzano. I'm probably not saying the name right.
Mangiaragina, eat grapes.
That's what it means.
And
Yeah,
and he was on the
in Sicilian. It's actually real Sicilian dialect.
he was in the Italian Lottery Commission between the families. And he got into trouble and was sent back to Italy. He was basically kicked out, and we never heard about this person before.
Right.
And it turns out there's some government documents about him that supported the story that was in the movie.
Oh yeah, I mean, I'm not saying he was the boss of the Bonanno family, at a very young age too. So he was there from till what, 68, from 31. Was that his realm? I believe Joe Bonanno. So yeah, he's gonna be convenient on what he wants to tell. It's selective. It definitely is. And another thing too, he was a pretty educated guy. He had schooling. That's another thing about the people from my town. A lot of them, even in the mob guys, they had some form of education.
Yeah, the guy Rick just mentioned, Mangiaricina, was from Partinico, and Angelo and Rick found that a bunch of the formative Bonanno members at the turn of the century were from Campo Reale and Partinico, and Bonanno seems to have kind of pushed that away, killed a few guys. Did you ever hear anything about those towns?
No, I know of the towns, but as far as my knowledge, back to American custodies affiliation with the Bonanno family. I personally start not at Zero, Colo Zero, which was somebody that Vito Grimaldi used to talk about too, believe it or not. We used to talk
Wow.
about the history and people who were around at the time. Not what they did, but who they were, and not who they were, but their significance, you know. But like I start with Maranzan, and that's my first um you know, not, as far as being somewhat knowledgeable and what I've heard in the past, and then go from him all the way up.
What
No,
did Vito Grimaldi say about Colaschiro?
Coloskiro was I forget, it's a while. Sometimes it was repetitive, and I didn't mean to be mean enough, but I would just be there, and I would be up in his office. We would talk. He go Buster. He would talk about Buster, some guy Buster. But he would talk about funny stories that they would have, like with the women or their wives, you know, and not knowing who they were, like good wholesome stories. They weren't about murderers or even robberies or anything like that. You know, when somebody messed up, he'd be in the doghouse for a while. That kind of.
yeah, it's the kind of thing that blows
Sometimes I
me.
felt like but sometimes I felt like he was talking like vicariously, but like, well, you know, one time this happened and he told him this, and that guy, there was this man one time, and I'd be like, oh, you meaning to me right now? What the fuck did I do this time? You know. But yeah, he had a very very large history. But one thing, it died with him for sure, and he wasn't very approachable type of guy anyway. To himself, nice man, though, very nice.
That he opened up to you.
Well, our families go back. My uncle's is my uncle John, I think, is probably the one he went back with the most, because not because they were close, they were friends, but just because my uncle was here before any of us, especially in the mob capacity.
Did you have any idea who your uncle first connected with in New York? Was it his paisans or?
I, this is again like secondhand knowledge. It was with the people who usually represented the rednecks back in the, and it made sense because that's who he was. He was mountain type, loved the farms, loved the animals, loved the livestock. Oh, my dad too. Everybody in my dad's side of the family. So we had affiliations to the Gregorios and that side of the Buchelatos, and we were always affiliated with them rather than like my dad's side. This is my dad's side. Then like, let's say the Ventres and the Bonannos. Okay, so now, like, for example, my uncle Cheech Navarro, his goddad is Nene Boventure, who's still alive, and he's got to be like in his 90s. That's his goddad. So my mother's side was more, they married into that side. They were more with that side than my father's side, who were more with the Buchelatos.
Yeah, it's one of the reasons we were happy to have you on is because, a lot of people know some of the bigger Castellamarese names, but the Fiordilino name is big. I mean, you guys were a clan unto yourself who are related to many names people know. So this was a good opportunity to talk about that, the Fiordilino name.
More in Italy than here, yes.
Right.
Yeah, definitely more in Italy. I had an uncle died in 75, was affiliated. Another uncle who passed away, the oldest, my uncle Joe, was affiliated with the Remis and Alcamo and that side of the family. But as far as the United States, yes, I had a lot. I think at one time, I think maybe 8 or 9 made guys of the United States, and couple even in other families.
The smallest little story, like even you just mentioning that Vito Grimaldi knew who Skiro was, blows our mind.
Yeah,
He
there you
knew
go.
of him, not that he, let's get that straight too, because people are, well, Vito was born in this, and he knew of him, of course. he was an
Mhm.
historian in that sense. So Vito was, he loved the mob historians. He used to say that his I think it was his grandma or his mom. I don't remember. I think it was his grandma used to tell him stories about the old timers, and he'd be listening like a kid or in awe. And I remember that my mom used to do the same thing with me, and but it more in a disciplinary way. Like this guy, he did this at that time, and he wasn't supposed to do that. So he was in, and they never knew who it was, but we always, this and that, and basically, we those little stories. And I was all about, you know, wow, I don't want to be like that guy.
Yeah,
That's
if you
interesting.
happen to remember any of those stories, please tell us.
Uh, yeah, I know. It's kind of like looking back. I was more interested in dumb stories, like John Gotti stories, I guess. But I wasn't getting them. I was getting the old stories. But in
You,
hindsight, I guess those are better stories to tell.
you
Yeah,
mentioned the
those old
women.
stories are gold.
Yeah, you guys would have. The only problem is he want to talk to you stuff. But don't take that in a wrong way. Um,
Not at all.
Of course not.
but yeah, he was definitely all about the old time, the right way. He figured the mob and the way that was at one time was the right way. If you had a problem and I could help you and I could lend you money, I'll lend you money. So he lent a lot of people money. He didn't charge them. Just because he knew them from the old time and they were going through a little something, he could do it. He actually believed there was something good about the mob. Some people beg to differ, but he got that out of that. That's what. Wow, yeah. Thinking about what happened at his funeral, I'm not going to get into that. And thinking about he actually found good in the mob, where a lot of people these days do not. That occurred, and it's sad.
You
Yeah, I
mentioned,
guess that depends on the individual. Did you hear any stories about how the mob started?
I was just going to ask that. Good question.
Where here in the United States or back in Italy?
In
Uh,
Italy.
You get so many like different theories and stuff, so I don't want to sound like an authority on something that I don't really know much about. I don't know. I've heard that they just Italy being one of the most corrupt places in the world, they didn't want to pay to the authorities, and they started their own little judicial system.
how far back do you have any sense of how far back your family went? I know in other conversations we've talked a little bit about it, but how far back does your personal family history go? Do you know?
As far as the mob,
Yeah, in Castellamare, right?
I'd have to guess my family was robbing livestock forever. And if did you affiliated that with the mob, that with my
Yeah.
grandfather's, not my dad, not my mom's grandfather. He was pretty good man. He was a good man. You get well, my dad's dad died young. He had all his kids into that kind of lifestyle, and he was suspected back in the day of a double homicide actually up in the mountains. And so it stops with him, but you got to remember he died. My dad was born in 24, and he died and his dad died when he was 9, so that's about 33. And I think he was like in his 40s, well, like late 40s at that. My grandfather, so he up to 1880, 1870. So I could go back to that as having a criminal in the family. But other than that, I can't go as far as I don't. I wouldn't know.
Yeah, in 1896 there was a big murder case that got a bunch of the guys who were in the family then, and there's like you mentioned Vinny Acero, his great grandfather was one of the guys. There
Right.
were a bunch of Bucciolatos, some names that
Sure.
don't show up later, but a lot of these guys can be directly connected. A lot of these
Yeah,
people were blood relatives.
The Saro name in Casamani is also those of the mountains. The Galante names, which we mentioned before, Coppola, they're mountain people too. When I mean mountain people, I'm talking about farm. They lived in the town, but they worked in the mountains and whatever else they were doing. And then you had they all lived in the so it's a town in the middle, mountains all over, and then you got the people in the water, the sea. And you had the fishermen or the farmers. They farmed by the water as well because the dirt was really good by the water. But tourism came in, and that was more lucrative than the eggplants, I guess. So
Okay.
that went another direction. But back to what I was saying, different last names associated with different clans.
And then marriage between them was obviously significant. That would.
Yeah, marriages when they were consensual, it was okay, but there was a lot of it that wasn't, unfortunately.
Oh yeah.
And the people from the mountains were known for that, like taking a bride, and that was it. They were married, they had kids, and they had a respect. They had once you took it was a common practice, not a common practice. It was a practice that was accepted.
Gotcha.
So kidnapping a bride.
Kidnapping a bride with if the family was opposed to it, and you'd have mob guys go and take somebody. It's like a caste system even back then. My kid's gonna go to school or whatnot. Even back then, and they were like, "Well, we like your daughter. We asked her twice. We asked her 3 times. They'll take her." And then, unfortunately, they were married.
Were there many arranged marriages by the parents setting it up?
I'm sure there was. I'm sure there was that. Yeah, yeah, in a roundabout way, but like those were like the ones I was mentioning before. That they happened. They didn't happen much, but they happened. And as far as the guy who ended up being the kidnapper did the right thing and took care of the family. I've seen marriages like that work. Unfortunately, like 30, 40, they have 5 kids and they're fine, but it was something that was going.
Reports came out of that in the 1870s in Palermo, members raping young women who were part of more prestigious families. And back in that time, to no longer be a virgin and not married, you're done in that society. So the alternative was to marry.
Raping. It's raping for sure, but they rationalized it as now they're being married. It wasn't like there was a no. Yeah. And
it wasn't. It wasn't like a rape and a lead, but they knew that if they defiled this woman would have no alternative but to either get married and bring the member into this esteemed family, or the esteemed family could say no, and then the daughter, her life was pretty much ruined. Because if she's no longer a virgin before marriage, 100
nobody's gonna
years ago,
nobody's gonna want her anyway.
Forget about it. Yeah,
that's correct.
The early Pentito, Melchior Allegra, he talked about how a guy was made into the Alcamo family. This is 100 years ago. And then the leadership of Alcamo immediately arranged a marriage to the daughter of the boss of San Giuseppe Iatto. So that was something that happened too. He got made, and then within days, I think it was, they arranged a marriage to this boss's daughter. So that was obviously a political sort of arrangement within the mafia.
Yeah, yes, there was like little resistance on that. It was yes, it was a practice, but it not as drastic of tragic as the other the latter, but that did occur. Yes.
All right, everyone. Hope you enjoyed this episode. We'd like to extend a great thanks to Frank Fiordilino, who's really expanded our knowledge into this, and we wish you all a good night.
Thank you.
Thanks
Thank you,
so much,
Frank.
Thanks a ton.
Good night.